In April 2018, the Royal Stockholm Concert Hall played host to the prestigious International Music Innovation Conference, attracting artists, composers, and scholars from around the world. It was a gathering of musical minds, all converging to explore the future of sound. Among the speakers was Eric Lindstrom, a revered figure in European jazz, known for his decades-long career, multiple awards, and extensive influence. Dressed in a crisp black suit, Lindstrom sat confidently among fellow panelists, surrounded by elegance and formality. The atmosphere buzzed with expectation. Seated among the audience was Carlos Santos, a Filipino musician who had spent his life mastering traditional instruments from his homeland: bronze gongs, bamboo percussion, and a two-stringed kudyapi. Carlos had come not only to perform, but to pose a question, one that challenged conventional views on musical relevance. As the discussion turned toward innovation and global integration, Carlos raised his hand. With calm conviction, he asked whether instruments from the Philippines could have a role in modern music composition. His words were met with an icy smile. Lindstrom's response, sharp and dismissive, would spark an international firestorm and mark the beginning of a story no one expected. The room fell into an uneasy hush as Lindstrom responded. With a tone that balanced civility and condescension, he labeled Filipino instruments as primitive relics, he called them, fit for cultural exhibitions rather than modern stages. He argued they lacked complexity, tonal breadth, and refinement. Charming in a folk village, he said, but not built for serious music. The words struck like a dissonant chord. Many in the audience shifted uncomfortably, unsure how to respond. Carlos remained composed, absorbing the insult with the quiet resilience of someone who had heard it all before. Growing up in Mindanao, he had often been told that his music passed down from his grandmother was less valuable than Western forms. Music schools had denied him. Venues had ignored him. But this moment felt different. It wasn't just about one man's opinion. It was a public declaration made on an international stage. As Carlos sat down, the murmur in the room grew louder. Filipino musicians in the audience looked visibly shaken. Though the panel moved on, the moment had already escaped the walls of the concert hall. Within hours, clips of Lindstrom's comments had gone viral, and Carlos, who had asked a simple question, was now at the center of a global conversation. The internet erupted. Lindstrom's remarks spread like wildfire across music communities, cultural forums, and social platforms. Filipino musicians worldwide expressed anger and disbelief. Artists from across Southeast Asia weighed in, defending not just Filipino instruments, but the broader importance of indigenous music traditions. Hashtags like hashtag Respect Filipino Music and hashtag KULINTANG is not primitive trended throughout Asia. Debates flared in jazz circles. Was Lindstrom simply being honest about technical limitations, or had he exposed a deeper bias against non-Western music forms? In Manila, students at conservatories organized forums. In Toronto and Los Angeles, Filipino diaspora groups held impromptu performances of traditional music as a show of pride. Meanwhile, Carlos remained quiet. He returned to the Philippines, declining interviews, but quietly began preparing. While some wanted to respond with words, Carlos chose music. For 6 months he worked intensively, not to defend his culture, but to elevate it. Collaborating with a Filipino arranger, he designed a performance that would speak for itself. He wasn't seeking revenge. He was reclaiming a voice. Then came the unexpected twist. The Stockholm Jazz Festival invited Carlos to perform on the same stage, just minutes before Lindstrom's headline act. It was a chance to show, not tell, and Carlos accepted. October arrived with the Stockholm Jazz Festival in full momentum, its reputation drawing critics, scholars, and devoted listeners from across Europe. The main hall was sold out, and anticipation centered on the headline performance by Lindstrom and his celebrated ensemble. Yet beneath the excitement, quiet tension simmered. Festival director Ingrid Halvarsson had made a deliberate decision that stirred controversy behind the scenes. Carlos Santos was scheduled to perform immediately before Lindstrom. To some it seemed provocative. To others it was overdue recognition. Lindstrom reportedly objected, arguing that a traditional musician did not belong in a premier jazz setting. Halvorsen stood firm, insisting that innovation demanded listening beyond comfort. As the evening approached, Carlos prepared backstage in near silence. He carefully arranged instruments chosen not for spectacle, but for meaning pieces shaped by generations of craftsmanship. His wife reminded him that the performance was not about rebuttal, but about honoring lineage. Carlos carried with him months of preparation and decades of memory. He had studied Lindstrom's compositions closely, not to imitate them, but to understand the language they spoke. This performance was designed as a conversation across cultures, whether or not the other side expected to listen. When Carlos stepped onto the stage, applause followed, polite but restrained. The audience's curiosity outweighed expectation. He seated himself simply, without theatrics, and began with the kudyapi. Its resonant tones filled the hall with a melody rooted in Mindanao tradition, unhurried yet deliberate. The unfamiliar sound silenced whispers. Slowly attention sharpened. As Carlos transitioned to the Kulintang, his hands moved with precision, weaving layered rhythms that interlocked seamlessly. What emerged was not random percussion, but a carefully structured musical architecture. Patterns repeated, shifted, and expanded with mathematical clarity. Listeners leaned forward. The music carried both restraint and intensity, inviting patience rather than demanding applause. Backstage, Lindstrom observed through a monitor, initially unmoved. He dismissed it as folkloric charm. But as the piece evolved, complexity deepened. Carlos introduced subtle harmonic variations, demonstrating tonal control that contradicted earlier claims of limitation. Each instrument revealed unexpected range. The whole grew still, not out of politeness but absorption. Without speaking, Carlos was establishing a premise. These instruments were not artifacts. They were systems capable of nuance, discipline, and evolution. The audience was no longer evaluating. They were listening. The performance shifted again as Carlos introduced bamboo instruments, coaxing from them sounds that mimicked bass lines, wind harmonies, and percussive accents. Through careful technique, he expanded their sonic identity beyond expectation. Then came a turning point. Carlos began reinterpreting a familiar jazz standard, translated entirely through Filipino instrumentation. The melody remained recognizable, but its texture transformed. Swing rhythms emerged from gongs. Chords bloomed from strings. Improvisation unfolded with confidence and restraint. Jazz scholars in attendance recognized the structure instantly. This was not novelty, it was fluency. Phones appeared despite venue rules. Critics scribbled notes rapidly. The music built toward a finale that blended indigenous themes with modern composition, narrating struggle, survival, and continuity without a single lyric. When the final note faded, silence lingered, not hesitation, but awe. Then the hall erupted. The standing ovation was immediate and sustained. Applause thundered for minutes, echoing against the walls of a venue that had hosted legends. Carlos bowed repeatedly, visibly overwhelmed. For many in attendance, the performance reframed assumptions they had never questioned. For Lindstrom, watching from the wings, it dismantled certainties built over decades. When Lindstrom's ensemble took the stage later that evening, their performance was polished and disciplined. The musicianship was unquestionable, yet something intangible had shifted. The audience listened respectfully, but comparison was unavoidable. What followed Carlos felt familiar, even predictable. Lindstrom sensed it immediately. The room's energy no longer belonged to him. After the set concluded, applause came, but without the earlier fervor. Backstage, Lindstrom did not linger. He walked directly toward Carlos, who was carefully packing his instruments. The Filipino musician looked up, prepared for indifference or critique. Instead, Lindstrom extended his hand. His voice, usually measured, wavered slightly as he spoke. He admitted error openly, without qualification. He acknowledged that he had judged without understanding, dismissed without listening. Carlos accepted the words calmly, explaining that his instruments carried accumulated knowledge, not simplicity. Their exchange was brief, sincere, and witnessed by several staff members. A photographer captured the handshake. Within hours, the image spread online. The symbolism was unmistakable. Authority yielding to humility, tradition standing equal with modernity. The narrative had reversed not through argument, but through performance. The viral moment ignited global attention. Millions watched the clip of Lindstrom's apology and Carlos's performance excerpts. Commentators praised the encounter as a rare example of accountability in elite cultural spaces. Music institutions revisited curricula. Conversations expanded beyond Filipino instruments to broader discussions about whose music is considered sophisticated. 3 months later, Lindstrom and Carlos released a collaborative album, blending Scandinavian jazz with Philippine instrumentation. Titled Bridges, it was received with critical acclaim. Reviewers highlighted its balance of respect and experimentation, noting how neither tradition dominated. The album won a Grammy, solidifying the collaboration's impact. Carlos received invitations to lecture and teach internationally, including at major conservatories. Filipino instruments appeared increasingly in jazz workshops and experimental compositions worldwide. For Carlos, the recognition was secondary to preservation. He continued teaching young musicians, emphasizing roots alongside innovation. For Lindstrom, the experience marked a turning point. In interviews, he spoke candidly about the dangers of assuming mastery equaled understanding. The Internet eventually moved on, but the implications remained. This was not a scandal resolved, but a boundary redrawn. Beyond awards and headlines, the story resonated because it exposed a deeper truth about cultural hierarchy. Instruments once dismissed as unsophisticated were revealed as complex systems shaped by history, environment, and necessity. Carlos's journey highlighted how marginalization often disguises itself as technical critique. What had been labeled primitive was, in reality, unfamiliar. The performance challenged institutions to reconsider whose knowledge is validated and whose is archived. For Filipino communities worldwide, The moment became a source of pride. Students who once hid their heritage found validation. Educators began integrating indigenous music into academic study, not as folklore, but as theory. Lindstrom's public acknowledgement mattered because it demonstrated that expertise does not excuse ignorance. The collaboration that followed proved that respect creates richer art than exclusion ever could. The festival itself gained recognition for facilitating a moment of genuine exchange rather than spectacle. In hindsight, the conference comment that sparked outrage became insignificant compared to what followed. The music once heard rendered the insult obsolete. Carlos often reflected that the outcome was never about proving someone wrong. It was about allowing sound to speak without translation. His grandmother's lessons echoed throughout the journey that music survives because it carries memory forward. The Stockholm performance did not modernize Filipino instruments. It revealed that they had never stopped evolving. Innovation did not arrive from abandoning tradition, but from listening deeply to it. Lindstrom's transformation underscored a parallel truth. Progress in art requires humility as much as skill. The Internet framed the story as reversal, but its deeper value lay in reconciliation. Two musicians from vastly different backgrounds found common ground through sound. Their collaboration demonstrated that cultural exchange thrives when approached as dialogue rather than extraction. The standing ovation marked more than appreciation. It signaled recognition long overdue. As years passed, the performance became a reference point in discussions about decolonizing music education. Scholars cited it as evidence that global music histories cannot be ranked linearly. Workshops used recordings from that night to illustrate rhythmic complexity beyond Western notation. Carlos continued performing internationally, always introducing his instruments by name, history, and function. Lindstrom supported these efforts publicly, lending credibility within institutions slow to change. The partnership reshaped both legacies. One was expanded, the other re-examined. Neither was diminished. The story endured because it offered a rare outcome accountability, followed by collaboration. Not cancellation, not defensiveness, but growth. For audiences, the lesson extended beyond music. It challenged how expertise is defined and who is permitted authority. The assumption that progress moves only from west to west was quietly dismantled. Carlos's instruments, once deemed obsolete, proved adaptable and expressive within contemporary frameworks. Lindstrom's apology mattered because it was not strategic. It was necessary. Together their journey reframed innovation as something that listens backward as much as forward. The Internet may remember the clip, but the industry felt the shift. Opportunities widened, boundaries softened. At its core, the story is not about humiliation or victory. It is about attention. Carlos did not demand validation. He offered music. Lindstrom did not lose status. He gained perspective. The audience did not witness a debate. They experienced transformation. These moments are rare because they require vulnerability on all sides. The Stockholm stage became a site where assumptions dissolved under sound. That is why the performance endures not as controversy, but as correction. Cultural traditions survive not by isolation, but by engagement that honors origin. Filipino instruments were never silent. They were unheard by those unwilling to listen. Once heard, they demanded respect not through novelty, but through mastery. The collaboration that followed proved that tradition and innovation are not opposing forces. They are threads in the same fabric. When treated as such, music becomes not a hierarchy, but a conversation. What began as dismissal ended as recognition, not because opinions changed overnight, but because evidence was undeniable. Sound carried what words could not. The Stockholm performance demonstrated that sophistication is not exclusive, and that history, when engaged honestly, expands the future rather than limiting it. Carlos Santos did not elevate Filipino instruments that night. He revealed where they had always belonged on the world's most serious stages, speaking in their own voice, finally heard.